In the days and months following the September 11th terrorist attacks, Americans grappled with the threat of terrorism here in the U.S. There was the now defunct color-coded warning system favored by former President George W. Bush. Then we switched to a system that would alert us if there was information about a specific attack. So far, no alert has ever been issued using this system. But the Somali terrorist group Al-Shabaab is raising the specter of domestic attacks once again, and the question of how exactly Americans are supposed to respond. Al-Shabaab showed the world what it was capable of in 2013. The terrorist group brutally attacked a Nairobi shopping mall, killing more than 60 people. Now, in a new video, Al-Shabaab is encouraging similar violence here in the U.S.
What if such an attack was to occur in the Mall of America in Minnesota?
Located in the Minneapolis suburb of Bloomington, the Mall of America is a retail juggernaut and a major tourist attraction. Also suggested as a target, the West Edmonton Mall in Alberta, Canada, where officials downplayed the threat.
This was a very general comment. It wasn't specific.
Still, the Mall of America is ramping up security. And over the weekend, Homeland Security Secretary Jet Johnson urged anyone visiting the Minnesota Mall to take Al-Shabaab's threat seriously.
What we're telling the public in general is you've got to be vigilant. If anyone is planning to go to the Mall of America today, they've got to be particularly careful.
Right now, Johnson says there's no credible intelligence suggesting an attack is imminent. But given the way terrorism is evolving, he adds, that's not actually reassuring.
You and I won't necessarily know about when the next bad actor is going to strike.
Something recent attacks in Europe have shown all too well. So how serious is the threat posed by Al-Shabaab and similar terrorist groups? I'm joined now by Darren Q, who directs the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development at UMass Boston. Darren, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Why do you think Al-Shabaab released this video now, and why do they mention malls in Minnesota and Alberta, Canada, as well as shopping centers in England?
I think there's a couple of motivations for this, and there's still some speculation as to what their real motivations may be. One line of speculation is that this has nothing to do with their external environment. It's far more of a competition with ISIS over leadership in the religious extremist world, as it's affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is in a competition over the control in the Middle East.
Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda are affiliated?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And so there's one line of thinking that says that this is an effort to try to regain some of the public discussion. But I think the second line of thinking is that certainly Al-Shabaab has been on the defensive for the last few years. The Somali government certainly looks far more stable than it has in previous periods. And so a shout out to any sort of affiliates or sympathizers that it may have in the West is a useful tactic from their perspective.
Al-Shabaab's size has been declining, right, in recent years? The group is. How has that occurred? How big was the group, and how big is it now?
The group. I'm not sure on its size in the past, but I think the group has at least been declined by about a third of what it was at its height about 5-6 years ago.
So that's a pretty precipitous decline, right?
Yeah.
Is another reason for releasing the video now possibly that we just came off this Countering Violent Extremism Summit held at the White House? Is there any chance this is sort of a direct pushback at that, or am I being a little tinfoil hatty with that?
The timing is tempting to think that, and I think that first line of argument that I mentioned, that looking at this in terms of trying to grab airtime, would maybe be influenced by the fact that there was the summit in Washington last week.
Okay, now what about Minnesota and Edmonton? Why those two places? Why start with the Mall of America in a Minneapolis suburb?
Well, Minnesota in particular because it's where the largest Somali immigrant community in the United States is based, and I believe Edmonton is well on the Canadian side. So these are locations where you have large Somali communities, and I think that that's exactly where Al-Shabaab is hoping to gain adherence and to influence any, particularly I think younger men that might be interested in joining up or in engaging in the sort of activities that they're hoping to see.
And they've had success with that in Minnesota, right? I mean, I was looking at a review from, I think, Minnesota Public Radio of close to 30 young Somali men, as of a couple years ago, who had gone and fought for al-Shabaab in Somalia. So have they done that in Edmonton as well? Have they been able to draw people?
Yes, I think they've drawn from Somali communities all around the world that are part of the diaspora. But I think it's very important to remember as well that this goes in both directions in the sense that one of the dangers of this current circumstance is that we could be stereotyping or over-targeting Somali immigrants here in the United States and in Canada, when in fact, those communities are actually far more dangerous to al-Shabaab back home, because we're seeing now that there is sort of increasing peace. Maybe peace is too strong a word, but certainly increasing stability in Somalia. Many of the diaspora communities are returning home, and they're bringing with them the values and the experience that they've had here, plus the close relationships that they have in the United States, and that these communities are essential for I think our understanding of the situation back in Somalia, but also they will be important parts of rebuilding Somalia, and that's really the core of where these terror groups are flourishing.
People in Minnesota, from the reports I've read and seen, seem to be a little bit freaked out. Let's take a look at a couple quick reactions from people at the Mall of America.
Yeah, I'm scared because I have kids. I have 2 little ones and I'm pregnant. So coming here today, I was kind of like,
yeah, I don't know.
I thought we had another reaction. We've only got the one. But how do you think people should process advice like Jed Johnson gave the other day, saying essentially, yeah, if you're going to the Mall of America in the next few days, you should be really, really vigilant? How does the ordinary man or woman make sense of that?
Yeah, I think that it's important to be careful, and of course in his position, I mean, that's exactly the sort of advice he has to be giving. I think for the rest of us, however, I mean, I think the likelihood of something like this happening in random malls, across the United States are certainly low. I think ones like that one that have been targeted exactly by the statement of al-Shabaab, certainly you have to be careful about. But the Mall of America has certainly been a target for some time, just because of its size and its importance in terms of the symbolic value of it with American culture.
Yeah, it's sort of a temple to Western capitalism, right?
Much like the World Trade Center certainly was. So in that sense, I think it has that kind of importance.
Johnson's warnings came at a time when the Department of Homeland Security is facing the prospect of a partial shutdown. And I remember back when this sort of thing would happen under President Bush, invariably people would say, oh, I wonder if this presentation of risk or their assessment of risk is aimed at achieving some sort of political end. Do you think that that's a question worth asking here, or are the White House and the Department of Homeland Security responding in a responsible way to a new development?
I think they have to respond. I mean, it would be irresponsible of them not to say something when you get this sort of a threat that comes out from a credible terrorist organization like al-Shabaab. I think what we're seeing is the beginning of us heading in the steps much like Europe, in the sense that after September 11th, the main concern for terror has been less these international groups infiltrating the United States than domestically grown terror groups. And really, in Europe, they've suffered more in this regard, and the sort of security precautions that they've been taking there, I think we're going to start seeing a little bit more increasingly here in the United States.
Given that, and given that you've done a lot of work with the Somali community here in Boston, what do you think the right approach is to take if there's concern about these so-called lone wolf threats, but at the same time, the community itself is our best asset when it comes to preventing these and might bristle at being painted with a broad brush? How should we handle that?
Yeah, I absolutely think that the Somali community itself is our best allies in this, and they are just as or even more concerned about these sorts of terror links as anybody outside of the community is. I think the U.S. government at both the federal and the state level has for years reached out to community associations, both in the Somali and other communities, other immigrant communities in the United States, to try to build these relationships so that together they can figure out who are the possible individuals that are most at risk of these sorts of being wooed into this sort of activity, and to try to bring them back and to get them back on the path.
And my understanding is that in the Somali community, at least here in Boston, you've seen sort of different levels of risk breaking down on generational lines, right?
That's right. I think that it's very important that, the first generation of immigrants, like every immigrant community, they remain very much culturally of the country where they came from, but their children are brought up very much American, and in terms of the cultural experience that they've had. And so within families themselves, there are cultural divides, and this is something that's common to the immigrant experience across every immigrant group. And so the Somali community has that same divide.
So given that, just briefly, is the allure of al-Shabaab greater if you're a younger Somali who was, say, born here to immigrant parents, or if you're someone who came here as an adult?
Yes, I think somebody who's been born here is more apt to that, only because there's that key risk age between age 15 and 22, roughly, where all of us are developing our identity connections, thinking about who are the groups that we look up to. And I think particularly for the second generation, where you're caught in between, I've got one foot in the home country and I've got one foot here.
I don't quite belong in either.
Where do I fit? There are some individuals, just like any of us in that age, who get caught into gangs and other sort of antisocial activity. For people in that situation, they may be more susceptible to the sort of stuff you can get online now that comes out of al-Shabaab and a lot of the other terror groups worldwide that can be very appealing. That tells you you're important, tells you you're powerful, and tells you this is things you can do to be even more.
All right, Darren Q, thank you.
Thank you very much.